There is a moment in the summer of 1881 that American history has never quite been able to let go of. It happens in the dead of night in a darkened bedroom in Fort Sumner, New Mexico, and in the space of a single gunshot, Billy the Kid, the most wanted outlaw in the American Southwest, is supposedly gone forever. Sheriff Pat Garrett pulls the trigger, and just like that, the legend bleeds out on a cold adobe floor. Except, what if it didn't? What if Billy the Kid, the boy outlaw who escaped death more times than anyone thought humanly possible, did it one final time? What if Billy himself lived on, quietly, carefully, under an assumed name, in the dusty back roads of Texas, watching his own legend grow for nearly 70 more years? This isn't just idle campfire speculation. There are names, dates, scars, testimonies, and even a failed attempt at a presidential-level pardon attached to this theory. And when an old man showed up in 1949 claiming to be the most famous outlaw in American history, the world couldn't just look away. Now, a quick look at the data shows that the vast majority of you uncovering these secrets with us today haven't actually subscribed to the channel yet. If you're part of that unregistered majority, hit that subscribe button right now. Help us ensure the real history doesn't stay buried. Welcome to Historical Lore, and today we're pulling back the curtain on one of the most disturbing and surprisingly credible conspiracy theories in the history of the American West. Who was Billy the Kid, and why did the world want him dead? Before we can even begin to talk about whether Billy the Kid survived, we need to go back further than the shooting, further than the legend, and all the way down to the actual human being underneath all of it. His real name was almost certainly William Henry McCarty, though he also went by William Bonney, the name most history books settled on. He was born sometime around 1859, likely in New York City or Indiana, depending on which record you believe. His childhood was unremarkable in its tragedy. A father who vanished early, a mother who died of tuberculosis when he was barely a teenager, and a stepfather who had little interest in raising someone else's boy. By the time he was 15, William was on his own in the New Mexico territory, small and wiry and already learning the brutal arithmetic of survival on the frontier. The Kid, and people called him that even when he was alive because he genuinely looked like a boy well into his 20s, was not the brooding, menacing figure that Hollywood would later invent. Contemporary accounts describe him as cheerful, funny even. He danced at fandangos, told jokes, and reportedly charmed everyone he met, especially the Spanish-speaking communities of Lincoln County, who often sheltered and protected him. He was fluent enough in Spanish to pass, which was no small thing in that part of New Mexico, but he was also deadly. There is a real dispute about how many men he killed. The old legend says 21, one for each year of his life, but historians have generally settled on a more conservative count of somewhere between 8 and 9, most of them during the Lincoln County War. That conflict, which ran roughly from 1878 to 1879, was less a war in any formal sense and more a bloody, protracted feud between two powerful merchant factions fighting over control of the cattle and supply trade in southeastern New Mexico. Billy ended up on the side of John Tunstall and Alexander McSween, which happens to be the losing side, and the experience hardened him in ways his brief life hadn't quite managed yet. By 1880, he was a fugitive, a genuine one with a price on his head and Governor Lew Wallace's name attached to it. And here is where the story turns personal, because the relationship between Billy the Kid and Lew Wallace is not simply the relationship between an outlaw and the law. It is a story of a promise made, believed, and broken, and it is, in many ways, the emotional engine that drives the entire survival theory even today. Wallace was the territorial governor of New Mexico, and he was also, in his spare time, writing a little novel you might have heard of called Ben-Hur. He was a literary man, a Civil War general, a complicated political figure, and in 1879, he made a deal with Billy the Kid. Billy would testify about the Lincoln County war killings, specifically about the murder of a lawyer named Houston Chapman, and in exchange, Wallace would arrange a pardon. Billy would walk free. Billy held up his end. He testified and waited. And Lew Wallace, for reasons that remain somewhat murky, whether it was political pressure, competing interests, or sheer neglect, never delivered the pardon. Billy the Kid sat in jail, waited, grew impatient, and eventually escaped. And from that point forward, he was truly an outlaw with nothing left to lose, because the one man with the power to save him had looked him in the eye and lied. That betrayal matters. Keep it in your mind, because it echoes through everything that comes after. What actually happened the night in Fort Sumner? By the summer of 1881, Pat Garrett had been elected sheriff of Lincoln County specifically to deal with the Billy the Kid problem. Garrett was a tall, methodical man who had actually known Billy personally. They had been, by some accounts, something close to friends in the years before Garrett put on a badge. That detail has always added a particular sting to what happened next. Garrett tracked Billy to the Fort Sumner area, relying on a network of informants who knew the kid had ties there, specifically to a woman named Pauletta Maxwell, whose family owned a large ranching operation in the area. On the night of July 14, 1881, Garrett and two deputies rode quietly into Fort Sumner and made their way to the house of Pete Maxwell, Pauletta's brother. Garrett went inside to speak with Maxwell. His deputies waited on the porch. What happened next is, officially, simple. Billy the Kid came walking across the yard toward the house, noticed the deputies on the porch, two strangers he didn't recognize. He became startled and backed into Pete Maxwell's dark bedroom, asking in Spanish, "Who is it? Who is it?" right into the space where Pat Garrett was sitting beside Maxwell's bed. Garrett recognized the voice. He drew and fired twice. The first bullet struck Billy in the chest, just above the heart. He was dead, officially, within seconds. The body was laid out, viewed by local residents, and buried the next morning in the Fort Sumner Cemetery. Garrett filed his report. The newspapers ran the story. Billy the Kid was dead. Except the rumor started almost immediately. And this is not revisionist history invented decades later. Contemporary accounts, letters, local gossip, and reports from New Mexico newspapers at the time all contain early murmurs that Garrett may have shot the wrong man. The specific version of the rumor that circulated in the immediate aftermath of the shooting was that the dead man was actually a local Mexican, possibly a ranch hand, who had wandered into the wrong situation. Some versions of the story held that the man killed was not even a known criminal, just an unlucky stranger whose resemblance to Billy, or whose presence in the dark, had proven fatal. Why would that rumor start at all? Consider the circumstances. The shooting happened in a pitch-dark room. Garrett fired at a shape, a voice, a silhouette. There was no electric light, no clear identification before the shot. The body was viewed by a community who knew Billy personally, but it was also a community that had protected him, liked him, and in some cases may have had reasons to let a different story circulate. And Garrett himself, whatever his official account said, had interests in the matter. He needed Billy to be dead. His career, his safety, and his reputation all depended on it. None of this proves anything, but it opened a door. And doors, once opened in the American Southwest in 1881, have a way of staying open a very long time. The world Billy left behind, and the cracks in Garrett's story. Before we get to the man who showed up in Texas 68 years later claiming to be Billy the Kid, we need to sit with the immediate aftermath of Fort Sumner a little longer. Because the days and weeks that followed the shooting were not, by any stretch, the clean and unambiguous conclusion that Pat Garrett's official account suggested. They were messy, they were contested, and some of the doubt that would eventually fuel the Brushy Bill story was already beginning to crystallize within days of the shooting. Garrett filed his report with the territorial authorities. The newspapers picked up the story and ran it. The headline, "Billy the Kid Dead," spread across the Southwest and beyond. Dime novelists and journalists who had been building the kid's legend for years now had their ending. The story was complete, except that in Fort Sumner itself, among the people who had actually been there, who had known Billy personally, who had eaten at his table and danced at the same fandangos and watched him move through that community for years, the reaction was considerably more complicated. Several local residents reportedly expressed private doubt almost immediately. Nobody was shouting it from the rooftops. This wasn't the kind of doubt that makes it into newspapers or official records. It was the kind that stays in kitchens and on front porches, passed between people who knew better than to say too much out loud. And in Fort Sumner, there were plenty of those people. Part of this had to do with the viewing of the body. In 1881 New Mexico, there was no formal coroner's inquest of the kind that would later become standard. The body was viewed by locals, identified by people who claimed to know Billy, and buried the next morning. The process was fast. Some contemporary accounts suggest faster than it perhaps should have been, given the significance of the man supposedly being buried. An official inquest was technically conducted, and a jury of local men returned a verdict confirming that the deceased had died at the hands of Pat Garrett. But critics have noted over the years that this inquest was brief, that its participants had obvious reasons to conclude what they concluded, and that the process included none of the verification mechanisms that a modern death investigation would require. Then there is the matter of Pat Garrett's own behavior in the days following the shooting. Garrett was, by any contemporary account, a confident and self-assured man. He did not tend toward anxiety or second-guessing. And yet, in the period immediately following the Fort Sumner shooting, people who knew him noted that he seemed, and this is the word several historical accounts use, unsettled. He left Fort Sumner quickly. He did not linger in the place where he had supposedly just performed the most significant act of his law enforcement career. He returned to Lincoln, filed his papers, and got out. Now, there are entirely ordinary explanations for that behavior. Killing a man, even in the line of duty, even a famous outlaw with a price on his head, is not a casual act. Anyone might want to put distance between themselves and the scene of such a thing. And Garrett had enemies in the region, friends of the kid who might be inclined toward revenge, which gave him practical reasons to move quickly. None of this proves anything disturbing about his motives. But the combination of the rushed burial, the simplified inquest, the community whispers, and Garrett's own quick departure created a narrative gap, a space where doubt could live. And doubt, once established in a frontier community where the official version of events was always viewed with a certain baseline skepticism, tends to grow rather than shrink. There is also something worth addressing that rarely gets the attention it deserves: the question of what Pat Garrett stood to gain. This is not an accusation. It is a structural observation about the situation Garrett was in. Garrett had been elected sheriff specifically to catch Billy the Kid. His entire political identity, his safety, and his reputation were tied to that objective. If he had shot the wrong man in that darkened bedroom, he faced a devastating choice. He could admit the mistake, acknowledge that Billy was still alive, and lose everything he had built. Or he could say nothing, let the story stand, and hope that Billy, now presented with an extraordinary opportunity for a clean disappearance, would take it and stay gone. This is the version of events that some of the more thoughtful proponents of the survival theory have advanced. Nobody is suggesting that Garrett and Billy sat down and planned this out. That's not how it works. What is being suggested is something far more ordinary, that the same story happened to serve both men perfectly, and neither one had any reason to correct it. Billy gets his freedom. Garrett gets his career. The dead man in Fort Sumner, whoever he was, gets a famous name on his headstone. Everyone moves on. Again, almost certainly not what happened. The historical evidence points against it, but as a structural possibility, as a set of incentives that existed in that moment in 1881, it is not irrational on its face. And the fact that it is not irrational is part of why it has lingered. There is one more piece of the immediate aftermath that bears examining: the reaction of Billy's known associates and friends. Several people who had ridden with the kid, sheltered him, or considered themselves his friends were still alive and present in the New Mexico territory in the weeks after Fort Sumner. Their reactions to the news of his death were, in some cases, oddly muted. Not the grief and outrage you might expect from people who had genuinely lost a close companion. A few of them, when asked directly in later years about their reaction to the news, gave answers that were strangely non-committal, speaking more about what they had heard than about what they believed. This is thin evidence. People grieve differently. The frontier was not a place that rewarded public displays of emotion, and Billy's friends had their own legal situations to manage without drawing extra attention to themselves by loudly mourning a dead outlaw. But it is another thread in the fabric of early doubt. Another data point in the argument that the official story of July 14, 1881 left some of its closest witnesses unconvinced, the man who called himself Brushy Bill. Fast forward 68 years. The year is 1949. New Mexico is no longer a territory but a state. Television is beginning to creep into American living rooms. The Wild West is more memory than reality. And into this world walks an old man named Ollie P. Roberts, known to everyone around him as Brushy Bill, who announces, with apparent sincerity, that he is Billy the Kid. Brushy Bill was living in Hamilton, Texas, and he was brought to public attention largely through the efforts of a man named William Morrison, a lawyer and investigator from Missouri who had stumbled onto Roberts' story while working on an unrelated case. Morrison had been tracking down leads for a client in the early 1940s when someone mentioned, almost in passing, that there was an old man in Texas who claimed to have known Billy the Kid personally, really personally, meaning as himself. Morrison was skeptical, but he tracked Brushy Bill down, and what he heard over subsequent conversations was extraordinary. Brushy Bill didn't just claim to be Billy the Kid, he claimed to have details, specific, granular, obscure details about the kid's life that no casual student of Western history would have known. He described episodes from the Lincoln County War that weren't in any of the popular histories. He named names, described personalities, recalled conversations. He knew about the private arrangement with Governor Lew Wallace. He described the layout of places he claimed to have been in ways that investigators later said checked out against historical records. He also had physical markers that Morrison found compelling. His eyes were blue, the same shade contemporary witnesses had described for Billy. He had a scar on his right hand that corresponded to a documented wound Billy the Kid had received. He had another scar on his lip, and his trigger finger, reportedly, was shaped in a way consistent with someone who had fired a gun thousands of times over a lifetime. Brushy Bill's story of how he survived the night in Fort Sumner was this. Pat Garrett had indeed come to Pete Maxwell's house looking for him. But Billy, having been tipped off that Garrett was in the area, had been cautious. The man who walked into that dark bedroom was not Billy the Kid, but someone else, a man whose identity Brushy Bill either couldn't or wouldn't name. Garrett, in the darkness, killed the wrong man. And Billy, realizing what had happened and understanding that this was, improbably, his greatest gift, a clean disappearance, a confirmed death, a fresh start, had taken it. He had simply walked away from his own life and built another one. The name Brushy Bill, incidentally, came from his habit of riding through brush country on the Texas frontier. He was, by all accounts, a genuinely rough, weathered old man with the look and manner of someone who had spent a hard life in hard country. He was in his 90s, or so he claimed, when Morrison found him. And what did Brushy Bill want? He wanted what Billy the Kid had always wanted. He wanted the pardon that Lew Wallace had promised him all those decades ago. He wanted his name, his real name, he said, cleared before he died. The meeting that changed everything. Morrison, convinced enough by Roberts' story to act, arranged something remarkable. In November of 1950, he brought Brushy Bill Roberts to Santa Fe, New Mexico, to meet with Governor Thomas Mabry. The purpose of the meeting was simple. Brushy Bill would present his claim, answer questions, and the governor would consider whether to grant the pardon. What happened in that meeting became one of the most controversial moments in the entire Brushy Bill saga. By some accounts, Roberts performed admirably at first, answering questions about Billy's life with confidence and apparent accuracy. He described events, people, and places. He was, witnesses said, surprisingly lucid for a man of his claimed age. But as the meeting wore on, something shifted. Roberts became confused. He struggled to answer certain questions. His memory, which had seemed so sharp on some topics, appeared to falter on others. By the end of the meeting, Governor Mabry declined to grant the pardon. He was not convinced. Brushy Bill Roberts died approximately 1 month later, in December 1950, of a heart attack in Hico, Texas. He never received his pardon. He never officially got anyone in authority to believe him. And yet the story didn't die with him. If anything, it grew. Morrison continued advocating for Roberts' claim in the years after his death. A book was eventually written. Documentaries followed. And the central question, whether Brushy Bill Roberts was actually Billy the Kid, living in disguise for nearly 7 decades, became a permanent fixture in the mythology of the American West. The evidence and why it's complicated. If you're finding this story as fascinating as we do us a favor right now. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss another deep dive into the hidden corners of history here at Historical Lore. It genuinely helps us keep making content like this. Now, back to the evidence. So what do we actually have? Let's be rigorous here, because this story deserves rigor. The evidence for Brushy Bill's claim falls into several categories, and they're worth examining one by one. Physical evidence. The scars and eye color arguments are the most frequently cited, and they carry genuine initial weight. Blue eyes, a scar on the right hand, a scar on the lip. These details correspond to documented descriptions of Billy the Kid, but they also describe tens of thousands of men who lived in the American Southwest in the late 19th century. Scars were extraordinarily common. Blue eyes were not rare. This evidence is suggestive at best, and it proves nothing in isolation. In 2005, a facial recognition analysis was conducted comparing photographs of Brushy Bill Roberts with the famous tintype photograph of Billy the Kid, the only authenticated image of the Kid taken during his lifetime. The analysis, conducted by researchers using computer imaging technology, reportedly suggested a potential match between the two faces. This is the most scientifically interesting piece of evidence supporting the Roberts claim, and it cannot simply be dismissed. However, it is also worth noting that facial recognition technology, particularly when applied to historical photographs of varying quality and angle, has significant limitations. The same technology has produced false positives in other historical identification cases. A potential match is not a confirmation. Testimonial evidence. This is where things get genuinely complex. Brushy Bill's detailed knowledge of Billy the Kid's life impressed multiple investigators who spoke with him over the years. He knew things, specific, obscure things, that the general public would not have known in 1949. But there's a counter-argument that is difficult to fully dismiss. By 1949, there was already a substantial body of written material about Billy the Kid. Pat Garrett himself had written a book about his pursuit and killing of the Kid back in 1882. Later, writers and journalists had added to the record. It is not impossible, in fact, it is quite plausible, that a dedicated, intelligent person could have absorbed enough of this material over a lifetime to replicate the appearance of insider knowledge. The DNA problem. The cleanest way to resolve the Brushy Bill question would be DNA. Exhume Billy the Kid's body, extract a sample, and compare it to known descendants or DNA from Robert's grave. Simple in theory, an absolute nightmare in practice. Attempts to exhume the grave at Fort Sumner, New Mexico, where Billy the Kid is supposedly buried, encountered immediate problems. The first issue is that the original grave was poorly marked and has been disturbed multiple times over the years. The famous headstone that stands in Fort Sumner today, the one protected by an iron cage because it has been stolen multiple times, may not actually be positioned over the correct burial site. A 1961 attempt to locate the body was inconclusive. A more serious effort in 2003, involving forensic experts and modern ground-penetrating radar, also failed to definitively locate remains that could be confidently attributed to the Kid. Complicating matters further, authorities in Lincoln County and Guadalupe County, New Mexico, both of which have some jurisdiction over the relevant sites, have been locked in legal disputes for years over who has the right to authorize any exhumation. The county of Brushy Bill's burial in Texas has its own complications. The result is a DNA question that, as of the time of this recording, remains unanswered. Not because the science can't resolve it, but because the political and legal machinery surrounding it simply hasn't allowed the science to happen. That unresolved DNA question is one of the reasons the theory persists. When you can't definitively close the case stays open. The world Brushy Bill described in the details that troubled skeptics. One of the things that tends to get glossed over in quick summaries of the Brushy Bill story is just how specific his testimony was. William Morrison, the investigator who first brought Roberts to public attention, was not a credulous man. He was a lawyer. He had professional reasons to be skeptical and personal reasons to verify. And the account he left of his conversations with Roberts over multiple years includes details that Morrison found genuinely difficult to explain away. Let's walk through some of them. Roberts described in considerable detail the layout and atmosphere of several locations that were central to Billy the Kid's life, places that Roberts, if he were simply a fraud, would have needed to research carefully. He described the interior of Lincoln's old courthouse, the building from which Billy the Kid made his famous escape in April 1881, killing 2 deputies in the process. The escape from Lincoln County Jail is one of the most celebrated episodes in the entire Billy the Kid story, and Roberts' description of it was not the version you would find in any of the popular histories available in the 1940s. He described it from the inside. The dimensions of the stairway, the particular angle of approach, the feel of the building in a way that Morrison said felt less like memorized detail and more like physical memory. He described the Lincoln County War itself from the perspective of someone embedded in it, not as a distant participant observing events from the outside, but as someone who had been in specific rooms during specific conversations. He named men who had played minor roles in that conflict, men whose names did not appear in any of the popular histories of the era, but whose existence was later confirmed in historical records that Morrison and other investigators checked. Then he described Lew Wallace. And this is where it got interesting. Roberts wasn't talking about the Wallace that history remembers, the decorated general signing papers and giving speeches. He was talking about the man behind closed doors, how he sat, how he chose his words in a private room when it was just the 2 of them. The specific things he said, word for word, that Morrison couldn't find written down anywhere. When Morrison later tracked down documents from the period, he found that at least some of what Roberts had described about his arrangement with Wallace corresponded to private correspondence that had never been made publicly available. Now, does this prove anything? Not definitively. There is always the possibility that Roberts had access to information through oral sources, conversations with people who were present, and the kind of informal frontier network of memory and story that doesn't leave a paper trail but can transmit remarkable amounts of detail across generations. Living on the Texas frontier across those decades, a man could easily have met people with direct, first-hand knowledge of the Lincoln County War and everyone caught up in it. The kind of people who never spoke to a newspaper in their lives but would tell you everything if you sat with them long enough. But Morrison's point was not that this information was impossible to obtain. His point was that the totality of it, the volume, the consistency, the specificity, the texture of Roberts' knowledge, went well beyond what any of the available historical sources would have provided. Brushy Bill didn't just know the broad strokes of Billy the Kid's story, he knew the feel of it. And Morrison argued, not unreasonably, that the feel of a life is something you live rather than something you live rather than something you learn. There is also the question of how Roberts talked about the people in Billy's life. He didn't speak about them the way someone reciting history would. He spoke about them the way you talk about people you've actually known, with all the messiness and contradiction that real relationships carry. He spoke about Pat Garrett, for instance, not with the burning resentment you might expect from a man who had supposedly been betrayed, but with something more complicated. A mixture of recognition, wariness, and something that witnesses described as almost reluctant respect. He spoke about Polita Maxwell with a warmth and specificity that several researchers found striking. He spoke about Tom O'Folliard and Charlie Bowdre, both of whom died during Garrett's pursuit of the kid, with the quiet, unresolved grief of someone who had survived people he loved and carried that survival as a kind of guilt. None of this is forensic. All of it could be manufactured by a skilled and dedicated fabricator. But Morrison, who spent years with this man, argued that the emotional consistency of Roberts' story over time, the way it held together not just as information but as experience, was one of the things that kept him, personally, from simply dismissing it. There is also one specific episode that Roberts described which Morrison found particularly compelling, and which has not received enough attention in popular accounts of the Brushy Bill story. Roberts described in detail a period during the Lincoln County War when Billy and a small group of his associates were trapped in a burning building, the McSween House in Lincoln, in July 1878, and had to make a desperate run through gunfire to escape. This event is well documented historically, but Roberts described it from the inside in a way that differed in specific details from the standard historical account. He described a route of escape that wasn't in the history books. When Morrison investigated, he found corroborating evidence in local oral history from people whose families had been present that supported Roberts' version of the route rather than the published account. Was Roberts right about the escape route because he was there, or because he had spoken to someone whose family had been there? The answer to that question is genuinely unclear, but it is the kind of detail that serious investigators do not simply wave away. The case against, and why historians aren't buying it. Let's be equally honest about the counter evidence, because it is substantial and it deserves the same careful attention. The historical consensus, meaning the judgment of the overwhelming majority of professional historians, biographers, and experts in the history of the American West, is that Pat Garrett did in fact kill Billy the Kid on July 14, 1881, in Fort Sumner, New Mexico. This is not a tentative conclusion held weakly. It is, among serious scholars, about as settled as history from that era tends to get. The reasons for that consensus are multiple. First, there is the eyewitness testimony. Multiple people in Fort Sumner, including Pete Maxwell himself, saw the body. Several of them had known Billy personally. They identified the dead man as Billy the Kid. One could theorize that these witnesses were lying or mistaken or part of a conspiracy to help the kid escape. But the more witnesses you add to such a conspiracy, the more implausible it becomes. Human beings are not generally good at keeping secrets, especially secrets of this magnitude over decades. Second, there are the specific contradictions in Brushy Bill's own story. The real Billy the Kid was literate. He wrote letters, real, surviving letters, several of which are held in historical archives that reveal a man of reasonable intelligence and clear writing ability. Billy's letters to Governor Wallace in particular are articulate and thoughtful documents. Brushy Bill Roberts, by contrast, was reportedly illiterate. He could not read or write. This is not a minor discrepancy. It goes to the very identity of the man. Furthermore, when Brushy Bill's family records were examined by researchers, those records created problems for his claim. His birth records and the ages they implied didn't line up neatly with the timeline he was asserting. A man claiming to be Billy the Kid would have to have been born around 1859. Brushy Bill's documented history suggested a different timeline, and while records from that era were far from infallible, the inconsistencies were noted and judged significant by skeptical investigators. Then there is the matter of what happened during the Santa Fe meeting with Governor Mabry. We mentioned that Roberts grew confused toward the end. What we didn't mention is what specifically seemed to trip him up. When pressed on certain events, particularly events that the real Billy the Kid would have experienced directly and could not have forgotten, Roberts faltered. The gaps in his memory were not random. They seemed to cluster around the very episodes that would have been hardest to fake through research. Critics of the Roberts claim argue that this is exactly what you'd expect from a man who had studied Billy the Kid's life extensively but hadn't lived it. There is also a pattern worth noting. Brushy Bill Roberts was not the only person to claim to be Billy the Kid in the 20th century. A man named John Miller, living in Arizona, made similar claims and died in 1937, insisting he was the outlaw who had supposedly died in 1881. Miller's claim was investigated and not accepted. The existence of multiple claimants does not automatically invalidate Roberts' story, but it does suggest a cultural phenomenon worth thinking about. The American West, particularly in the twilight years of people who had actually lived through it, generated a certain kind of identity myth. Being Billy the Kid, even a Billy the Kid who had survived and reformed and lived quietly for decades, was a particular kind of story, and stories like that have always found tellers. I want to hear from you. Down in the comments right now, just one question. Do you believe Brushy Bill was telling the truth? Drop a yes or no, and let's see where this community stands. I read every single comment, and this is genuinely one of those questions where I'm curious what you think. why this theory won't die, and the deeper reason. Here is what I find most interesting about the Brushy Bill story, and what I think gets lost when we treat it purely as a question of historical evidence. The theory that Billy the Kid survived isn't really just about whether Pat Garrett shot the right man. It's about something older and more fundamental in American culture. The idea that the people who deserve better don't always have to accept the ending they were handed. Think about what Billy the Kid's story actually is, stripped of the legend. It's the story of a teenager who grew up with nothing, found a community that accepted him, fought on the losing side of a conflict that was really about wealthy men protecting wealthy interests, and then was offered a lifeline by a governor who took his testimony, used what he needed, and discarded the boy who gave it. Lew Wallace promised Billy a pardon. Lew Wallace never delivered. Billy the Kid died, if he died, if he died, if he died, as a man betrayed by the very government he had tried to work with. That story is uncomfortable. It doesn't resolve cleanly. The outlaw was supposed to be the villain, but the villain kept doing things that felt, in context, understandable. Escaping from jail rather than wait for a corrupt system to hang him. Killing men who had killed his friends. Writing letters to a governor who never wrote back. The survival theory offers a different ending. In this version, Billy the Kid doesn't die in a darkened room, shot by a man he once considered a friend, betrayed by a governor who used him and forgot him. In this version, Billy outwits everyone, the lawmen, the politicians, the legend itself, and lives. He lives long enough to grow old, to watch the West change, to see the railroads and the automobiles and the electric lights replace the world he knew. And then, at the very end, he tries one last time to get the pardon he was always owed. That's a story with a different kind of justice in it. Not the justice of courts and official records, but the justice of survival itself. The idea that the system didn't win, that the boy they tried to break found a way to keep going. Is it true? Almost certainly not, in the literal sense. The evidence against Roberts is real and serious. But the need for the story to be true, that's something else entirely. That's a window into what Billy the Kid meant to the people who lived alongside the legend, and what he still means to the Americans who keep returning to his story more than a century after his supposed death. The communities that believe, and why that matters. One of the more striking aspects of the Brushy Bill phenomenon is where the belief has been strongest. In Hamilton, Texas, where Roberts lived and died, there is a genuine local tradition around the idea that Brushy Bill was who he said he was. The Hico, Texas community, where Roberts actually died, has leaned into the story, with a Billy the Kid museum that frames the Roberts claim as at least plausible, drawing tourists and enthusiasts from across the country. Local historians in the region have, over the years, collected testimonies from people who knew Roberts personally, neighbors, acquaintances, people who shared meals with the old man. Many of them describe someone who was internally consistent in his claim over decades. Not someone who had recently decided to be Billy the Kid, but someone who had apparently lived with this identity, or with the secret of this identity, for a very long time. The emotional texture of his story, as described by those who knew him, reportedly felt less like a performance and more like a burden. That's not evidence in any forensic sense, but it is, perhaps, worth something as a human data point. Meanwhile, in New Mexico, in Lincoln and Fort Sumner particularly, the prevailing attitude is closer to the historical consensus. Pat Garrett killed Billy the Kid. The grave is there. The story is settled. The Brushy Bill claim is viewed, in those communities, as something between an amusing distraction and a mild insult to the actual historical record. The Billy the Kid Museum in Fort Sumner presents the 1881 shooting as established fact, the grave as a pilgrimage site. These communities have built an identity around the end of the story as it is officially recorded, and they are understandably resistant to having that end reopened. The two communities represent, in miniature, the larger argument about who owns historical truth, the official record or the living memory of the people closest to it. It's a tension without an easy resolution. The secondary claimants and the folklore ecosystem. Brushy Bill Roberts and John Miller were not, it turns out, operating in isolation. They were the most prominent voices in what we might call a broader folklore ecosystem, a loose, decentralized network of stories, claims, and alternative histories about Billy the Kid's fate that circulated through the American Southwest for decades after 1881. Some of these stories were small and local, the kind of thing passed down within a single family or a single community, never reaching the newspapers or the historians, just sitting quietly in the oral tradition of a particular place. Old men who claimed to have spoken with Billy after his supposed death. Women whose grandmothers had allegedly sheltered him during years of hiding. Communities in remote parts of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona where the story was simply accepted as common knowledge that the kid had gotten away. Most of this material is impossible to verify and easy to dismiss. Folk memory is not a reliable historical source, and the American West, particularly in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, was a place where legend and fact mixed freely, and the border between them was not always clearly marked. People told stories. Stories grew. By the time a family story had passed through 3 or 4 generations, it might bear only a passing resemblance to whatever kernel of reality had originally generated it. But there is something worth noticing about the geography of these stories. They cluster in particular ways. The claims tend to originate in communities that were part of Billy's actual world, the areas he traveled through, the families he knew, the networks that had sheltered him during the Lincoln County War and its aftermath. They tend to come from Spanish-speaking communities in particular, from the New Mexican and Texas frontier families who had been closest to the kid during his lifetime, and who had the strongest reasons, personal loyalty, cultural solidarity, and a healthy skepticism of Anglo law enforcement to keep an alternative history alive. John Miller deserves a closer look here because his story has some elements that parallel the Roberts claim in interesting ways, and some elements that diverge sharply. Miller settled in Rama, New Mexico in the early 20th century and lived there until his death in 1937. Like Roberts, he claimed privately, not in any dramatic public forum, that he was the real Billy the Kid. Like Roberts, he had physical characteristics that supporters said matched descriptions of the kid. Like Roberts, he had detailed knowledge of the Lincoln County era. But unlike Roberts, Miller never sought a pardon or made any formal public claim. He told his story to people he trusted, let them believe it or not as they chose, and lived out his life in obscurity. When researchers examined his claim after his death, they found it unpersuasive for many of the same reasons that the Roberts claim was ultimately unconvincing: inconsistencies in physical description, complications in documented timeline, and the fundamental impossibility of placing him definitively in the locations and situations he described. What both Miller and Roberts represent, whatever their literal truth, is the persistence of a particular kind of story. A story that the communities of the American Southwest, particularly the poorer, more marginalized communities that had known Billy personally and had no particular reason to celebrate his death, needed to tell. A story in which the outlaw who had treated them with respect, who had spoken their language, who had danced at their celebrations and eaten at their tables, had not simply been disposed of by the mechanisms of Anglo law enforcement, but had found a way out. This is not a small thing to understand. Pat Garrett, whatever his personal qualities, represented a particular kind of official power in a region where official power had not historically been kind to Spanish-speaking communities. Billy the Kid, by contrast, had built genuine relationships across cultural lines in ways that were uncommon for Anglo outlaws of his era. His survival, even as myth, even as whispered story, meant something to those communities that went beyond mere historical curiosity. It meant that the people who had been on the wrong side of power had, at least once, managed to win. That is the emotional core of the entire survival tradition, not just the Brushy Bill claim. And understanding it helps explain why the stories persisted even as the evidence against them accumulated. These were not just historical theories. They were, in a specific and meaningful sense, acts of cultural memory, the insistence, passed from generation to generation, that the ending the authorities certified was not the ending the authorities certified was not the ending that actually happened. Whether any of the specific men who claimed to be Billy the Kid were telling the truth is almost beside the point. The truth that the tradition was preserving was of a different and more durable kind. It was the truth about who Billy the Kid was to the communities he had lived among. Not an outlaw to be put down, but a neighbor to be mourned, and possibly, in the best version of the story, a survivor to be quietly celebrated. The science that couldn't close the case. Let's spend a moment specifically on the DNA situation, because it deserves more attention than it usually receives. The core problem, as we touched on earlier, is that no one can agree on where Billy the Kid is actually buried. The Fort Sumner cemetery grave has a headstone. It has a marker. It has a padlocked iron cage built around it to prevent further theft. But whether the body beneath it is actually Billy the Kid, or for that matter, whether any intact human remains survive in that soil after nearly a century and a half, is genuinely uncertain. The kid's mother, Catherine McCarty, is buried in Silver City, New Mexico. DNA extracted from her remains could potentially be used to establish whether remains from the Fort Sumner grave are maternally related to her, and therefore whether they could belong to her son. This was, in fact, the basis of a serious scientific proposal made in the early 2000s. The problem is that political and legal battles between Lincoln County and Guadalupe County over jurisdiction and authority have repeatedly stalled any actual exhumation. There was a period, particularly around 2003, when it seemed like the legal obstacles might finally be overcome. Forensic investigators, ground-penetrating radar, scientific teams, they were all assembled and ready. But the political will necessary to allow the process to move forward simply never materialized. Property rights, jurisdictional disputes, concerns about disturbing burial sites, competing political interests in New Mexico's tourism infrastructure, all of it conspired to prevent the one test that could, potentially, resolve the question. As of now, the DNA question remains open. And as long as it remains open, so does the door. What the story tells us about American mythology. There is a broader pattern here worth naming. Billy the Kid is not the only historical figure whose death has generated a survival theory. Jesse James, John Wilkes Booth, even figures well outside the Western genre have attracted stories of improbable survival and hidden identity. The pattern seems to emerge most powerfully around figures who died violently, prematurely, or under circumstances that felt to at least some part of the public like an injustice. Billy the Kid checks all of those boxes. He was 21 years old. He was shot in the dark by a man who had been his friend. He had been offered a deal by the government and then abandoned. The circumstances of his death carry, for many people, the specific emotional weight of a story that ended wrong. Not morally wrong necessarily, but narratively wrong. The kind of wrong that makes you want to rewrite the ending. Survival theories are, in this sense, a form of folk justice. They are the stories that communities tell when the official story leaves something unresolved, when the ending doesn't satisfy, when the betrayal doesn't get addressed, when the punishment doesn't fit what came before. They represent an insistence that the universe is more just than the historical record suggests, that the right people, eventually, find a way to survive. The specific power of the Billy the Kid survival story lies in how it honors the one quality that every real account of the kid's life, friend and enemy alike, agrees that he possessed: the ability to escape when escape seemed impossible. Every chapter of his life before Fort Sumner contains at least one moment where death or capture should have been inevitable and didn't happen. He escaped from jail. He survived ambushes. He walked away from battles that killed men on all sides. The survival theory simply extends that pattern by one more chapter, the final escape, the ultimate outrunning of fate. Is it true? History says almost certainly not. But as a story, as a piece of American mythology, it is extraordinarily well made. It fits its subject perfectly. It honors, in its own strange way, who Billy the Kid actually was, the legend that refuses to be buried. So here is where we end up. In 1881, a young man named William Bonney, Billy the Kid, was reportedly shot and killed by Sheriff Pat Garrett in Fort Sumner, New Mexico. The historical consensus, supported by eyewitness testimony, official records, and decades of scholarly examination, holds that this is what happened. The most famous outlaw of the American frontier died at 21, was buried in that dry New Mexico earth, and the story ended. In 1949, an old man in Texas said that it didn't. He said he was there. He said he got away. He said he spent nearly 70 years watching his own legend from the outside, growing older and quieter and more weathered, waiting for a pardon that never came, waiting for someone to finally believe him. The governor of New Mexico didn't believe him. The historians didn't believe him. 1 month after his failed meeting in Santa Fe, Ali P. Brushy Bill Roberts died in Hico, Texas, without his pardon, without official acknowledgement, without resolution. His grave is there if you want to visit. So was the grave in Fort Sumner. 2 graves, 1 man. The science to resolve it has existed for decades. The will to use it has not. That gap between what could be known and what has actually been determined is where the theory lives. It is a small, specific gap in the historical record, but it is large enough for an entire mythology to breathe inside it. Large enough for books and documentaries and museum exhibits and YouTube videos and late-night arguments between historians and enthusiasts who are all, in some fundamental sense, asking the same question. Not just, did Billy the Kid survive? But do we want him to have survived? And what does that wanting tell us about who we are and what we need our history to mean? Billy the Kid, whoever he truly was, wherever he truly ended up, has never quite left us. He is still out there in the American imagination, young and fast and impossible to catch, always 1 step ahead of the men trying to close the book on him. Maybe that is his final greatest escape, not from a darkened room in Fort Sumner, but from the very finality of history itself. And maybe that is enough. If you made it all the way to the end, thank you, genuinely. This one took a lot of research and I hope it was worth your time. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the moment. Hit that button, drop a comment with your thoughts on Brushy Bill, and share this video with anyone who loves a good historical mystery. I'll see you in the next one.